There was the New York Times article that came out and kind of named the IDW. Is there a kind of paradox in that it's no longer dark?
Well, it was never dark, and that was a large part of the joke. We have only been dark to one thing, and that thing is the institutional media and the main platforms, be they academic or governmental. So, if you will, I think that the mainstream media has pretended not to notice us, just as they've pretended to find everything we say either vapid or outrageous. But I think that what's really going on is that there's been a monopoly, effectively, on narrative held by the collection of major institutional voices. The true spectrum of thought is far broader than people have been led to believe. And I think that's where the IDW comes in, that it's not that we're just outside of the Overton window. Many of the points we're making really aren't found anywhere inside of mainstream media and established institutions, even though many of these things that we are talking about are simply commonplace observations.
Did you have any doubts about that New York Times article?
I mean, I had an infinite number of doubts about the New York Times article. Part of me wants to work quietly, and part of me realizes that we have to work in some public-facing capacity. And I personally have found it much more comfortable to have a private life, to not have everything that I'm thinking broadcast to a large audience. But I think we've run out of time, and so I think some of us are somewhat reluctantly choosing to make a different call now.
So you're talking about a different way of thinking, people who have a different way of thinking. Is that what characterizes the members of the IDW?
It's hard to say. I mean, I would say that everybody in the IDW is fairly disagreeable in the sense of the Big Five personality inventory. So can you hold a position when you're the only person in a room that believes that thing? Like if it's you versus 100 people. I would say almost everybody in the core of the IDW is capable of holding a position where everyone is against you. And I think that trait is extremely rare.
Do you see the IDW as primarily a political project?
No, I don't. I see it primarily as a precursor to anything decent. It's what has to succeed for us to have a political conversation. I don't think we're having a political conversation, either internationally or nationally. I think we have people who are talking about nonsense positions. We just went back to the immigration position. There are only two positions I'm convinced aren't political. One is open borders, which is never going to happen, and the other one is closed borders, which is never going to happen. And yet, you very often encounter people who are talking in these terms as if these are the actual positions. So I don't think that we're having a political conversation. I think that what's been going on is that the mainstream media has been playing keep-away ball, right? So this game where you're throwing the ball over somebody who's trying to catch it. Now the public has been trying to get in on this conversation, but what keeps happening is that our fake left and our fake right are engaged in a completely fake conversation about fake items, including fake news, which they themselves are pushing out, and then claiming to fight fake news. So the whole thing is so saturated in falsehood that people are waking up to the idea, oh, I've forgotten what it sounded like for people to actually have a discussion about a topic and how much time it takes. In general, it can't be done with 4 or 5 voices on a panel in 10 minutes with a few commercial interruptions. There's just almost nothing can be discussed that way. And what's worse is that the very people who would be best able to discuss it are never going to be invited onto those programs.
In a way, the people in the IDW have been selected for. Like a lot of them have had quite high-profile encounters. You look at Sam Harris with Ben Affleck, or you look at Brett Weinstein, and there's a sense that they've in some way had to live out their ideas. There's a sense of bravery that they've had to stick up for themselves. Jordan Peterson and C16. I mean, you can list a lot of times where, as you say, they had to be that one person who was thinking a certain thing.
I mean, I think I made the point, probably on the Rubin Report, that what's going on is that when you ask any large collection of people to salute a nonsensical flag and pledge allegiance to it, And more or less everyone makes the calculation, I guess if this is going to get me through my day, I'll salute any flag. Then you've got the one gal or one guy who doesn't want to. Well, my observation is that that person is usually sitting on an entire mountain of interesting thoughts that they don't have the freedom to simply make a convenience readjustment. And so from that perspective, yeah, in general, if you ask 1,000 people to salute a flag that makes no sense and tell them that they'll be incentivized, you'll get a $1,000 check at the end, or you won't lose your job, and somebody stands up and says, no way, I'm getting out of here, do what you want. That person is usually much more interesting than just being a contrarian. That person is usually saying no because they've got an entire worldview that is built by hand and bespoke. And so that's why this method of finding people has been relatively fruitful. It's people who don't back down, usually don't back down for a reason, because there's every reason just to go along.
It seems that the phenomena of the IDW is part of this great intellectual awakening. I mean, you're seeing people being really hungry for long-form content on YouTube, 3-hour conversations. People are clearly hungry for a lot more intellectual stimulation.
I don't actually agree with this. I mean, this is an idea that I think Jordan has slightly wrong. So for a while I've been making the point that there was a change between writing for television was sort of the lowest form of an art, and that writing for movies allowed for real character development, but that the multi-season, multi-episode shows with very long storylines actually has the greatest character development, and so the greatest writers are now writing for TV. The important thing to understand is that it's not just the advent of long-form podcasting. What it is having the courage to say something using that medium. You have long-form podcasts that aren't attracting almost anybody. And the only reason that the IDW is behaving in a different fashion is that it's marrying the content that brave people are starved for with the change in technology. And so in general, most things don't work in a 3-hour format. What works in a 3-hour format is when you're living through what I'm calling left-carthyism, where the modern left, which is my side of the aisle, has gone so completely insane that people are starved for normal conversation as if it was samizdat in the former Soviet Union. And so you have an underground network, if you will, that is supplying that need for reality. And the only reason we're underground is because the mainstream is pretending, for the most part, not to notice that this phenomenon is existing, which is fascinating.
And you've described this as a civil war within the left. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. The left that I relate to is the left that realizes that the past cannot supply the answers and that we have to actually progress because we can't stay here. It is not the left that believes we can wish ourselves into a beautiful future by pretending that the world is different than it actually is. So I think that the key thing that is an agreement between these two groups is that we have to get to some sort of better place, and that is the progressive in progressivism. Where we are deeply divided, and again, these are the divisions that is much worse than between left and right. How these absolutely imbecilic figures believe that you can just wish yourself into paradise, that you don't have to worry about markets, that you can just say, free good things for everybody. Well, it just doesn't make a whit of sense. Or, you're going to wish human beings to be both simultaneously non-diverse, so that you can argue that any difference in pro rata shares of a group in any occupation is evidence of oppression. And then you're going to turn around and argue that people are actually incredibly different because we're going to get a huge benefit from diversity. I mean, this is not even self-consistent. This is this would be offensive to an intelligent 5-year-old. So I don't really believe that these progressives, as they call themselves, and regressives, as some of us call them, are even making serious intellectual points. They're sort of trolling by pretending to believe in all things that just gum up the works. And so it's very important to me that not only do we not really spend time debating people who are not serious in their intellectualism, but that we realize that it is important to the diversity of mature and important ideas that we not spend undue effort engaging ideas that are functioning very differently from regular conversation. It is as if somebody asks, should we have a diverse dinner tonight? Well, we could invite somebody from this position, from that country, from this gender, and then should we invite a suicide bomber? Well, if you're a suicide bomber, that bit of diversity is going to take down the entire conversation, as well as all the people at the table, right? Well, these are like suicide bombers in terms of their ideas. They are attaching themselves to real conversations and blowing up the conversation so that you can't actually speak. And I think what we need to realize that the diversity of ideas that have to be explored hinges on not allowing in bad diversity. That is, you don't want a single person at the table who wants to scuttle the conversation. And that's not something that we've understood about the modern left. The modern left is very often focused on scuttling any realistic conversation so that it can continue to threaten and terrorize people into pretending to hold positions that no sane person could possibly hold.
Why do you think it's become like this?
Well, I think my wife probably has the best explanation, which is that when you're actually dependent on labor for your voter base, labor has economic issues. So this is the great search for something cheaper than labor. And identity turns out to be much cheaper than labor. If you can get somebody to vote for you where you're going to take their future, their security, and their retirement, but you're going to celebrate the fact, that they came from Laos, that's a bad deal. Nothing against the Laotians, but for God's sake, stand up for yourself as a worker before you stand up for yourself as somebody who needs to see Southeast Asia celebrated on the national stage. It's not that exciting. Demand more from your representatives. This is the great search for the cheapest possible constituency. And that's exactly why I think it's happening. I think it's because the traditional Democratic voter base was too expensive. They wanted real change. They wanted to participate economically. They wanted to participate at the level of power. And the donor base said, isn't there anything cheaper than labor? And I think they found something.
And where do you hope that this IDW conversation will go in the future?
Well, I hope it goes to the heart of everything that is denying our ability to use our eyes and our ears and our minds as decent people. If you're simply observing the world as it is, and you're thinking about it with a big open heart, and you're trying to be decent about it at the same time that you're trying to provide for your family and concerned about your country's welfare, there's no reason that you should be huddling in the cupboard, afraid that if anyone hears that you think that men are different from women, that you're going to be consigned to the dustbin of history and fired for it. It's absolutely essential that people stop being terrorized for holding garden variety positions.